Yeah, so one thing I want to show you now, now that we've got everything set up, is kind of how Moodle stores some stuff in config, for example. So how do we like change some setting, and how does that actually affect the database, and how does that work? So let's look at our admin page, for example. This is the admin search page, which you get by clicking site administration as well. If we refresh here, it takes a little bit. If all the way at the bottom we see all this information printed in the footer. And this is basically just some developer debug information. And it's pretty useful a lot of the time. Like you can see your DB reads and writes, and then what items are using the cache. And a lot of the time for performance, we want to reduce any database reads and writes, and rather than that, use the cache when we can. But for example, what if we want to turn this off? Like this is just a developer setting. Maybe we want to turn it off as well. Well, we do that over in the development debugging area. So, uh, basically, this is the setting here, perf debug. And if we turn this on, performance information printed in the footer. So, we got the information there in the footer now. Let's see what happens if we turn it off. And now, as we can see, there's not much left in the footer. So that's cool. We can turn a setting on and off. What I want to show you now is kind of what's actually happening like in the backend when we do this. And then later on we'll make our own setting in another plugin and save that as well. So if we go back to Moodle, all these config settings are saved here in the Moodle config table. And let's just look at the structure of this table a bit. I mean, it's very simple. It's just a key value pair, name and value store. And yeah, we can just see that here. It's just got a name and a value. So we can, for example, find our perf debug setting. I'm just going to filter this. And it's 15. So that's just kind of a strange thing with this particular setting, is that they don't just make it 0 and 1 like a lot of these other settings, for example, like here, zeros and ones to turn it on or off. This setting, they turn it 15 for on, and if we turn it off, refresh, it's 7 for off. Okay, so that's what happens when we turn this setting on and off through the front end. So anything through the front end means we're coming here in the browser, going to the settings page, and we're doing it from the UI, basically. But we could also do this from the database directly. So if we did something like that, like for example, turn it back on, and we will see in a second that it'll refresh, and this will turn back to 15. So what if I change this back to 7? So in theory, I've turned this off now again. It's on here. Refresh again. It's still here. Which is a bit strange, but basically it's just another way that Moodle is trying to optimize its performance. It's cached the fact that this is on. So even though we've turned it off directly in the database, Moodle doesn't look in the database every page refresh for this setting. It's cached it instead, so it's not even doing any database query at all. So what we need to do to get Moodle to notice that is to purge caches. So we run the purge cache script, and what happens? Well, if we refresh, it'll take even longer to load now because it has to load all the theme and all the other CSS and all the other things that it hasn't cached now. And notice that it's on right now. Now we refreshed and it actually did notice that it turned off, right? So it's actually gone and done the query, find that it's off in the database, and then reflected that in our front-end UI, and that's why we don't see it here anymore. So it's just important to notice that, like, if we make changes in the database directly, they're not always going to reflect straight away in the front end like that. And so I guess the other thing to note would be like, why would we ever do it through the front end? You know, like it'd be nice to just do it all manually through the back end, or what's the advantages and disadvantages? Well, doing it through the back end often is quicker. You can update many different configs at once, like with some big complicated query, but you do miss out on some other things. So for example, let me show you another page in Moodle. I'll open it in a new tab, and we'll go to reports, and config changes. So when we update the setting here in the front end and turn it on, click save, it's not just the setting that changes, but other things happen too in Moodle. For example, logging who made the change. And that's what we can see here. You can see that at this exact time that I changed the setting to be 15, the admin user. But if we change it directly in the database, we don't get this log. So that's just one thing we miss out on, and it's just one like kind of a scary thing, or a reason that you wouldn't want to do it in the database directly, especially in any production system, because we might think that we just want to change this setting, but Moodle hooks in and does a bunch of other things like logging, or maybe throwing at some other events out there that do other things, that we want to make sure that we include that, and we always let Moodle do everything that it wants to do. So for example, like let's look at this. Like I've changed it to 15. So right now this is wrong, right? Because it's the last change I made in the front end was turning it on. Then I turn it off in the back end. Now it's off. But if we wanted to, for example, know who made that change, we can't. It's impossible to tell now how this setting got turned off. Let's turn it back on and just see that change now in the logs as well. So I turned it on. It's on. Cool. It shows up there, and it also is 15 now. But also, if we refresh the logs page, we actually can see a log of like who made the config change, and that's important. Like especially like in Moodle, something can go wrong. We want to know what's happening with our site. It's important to have the logs there to kind of track down issues. So in general, always make changes through the UI, because we don't know exactly what's going to happen. Moodle does a bunch of extra things that we make sure we want to have that all happening as well. And one more quick thing to show as well is that this is actually a good example, this perf debug setting, because let's say it's off right now, right? And we want to turn it on, and for some reason we thought to turn it on, it should be set to 1. And if we turn it on directly in the database like this, well, it turns out that when it's on, this value should actually be 15, not 1. So by doing it directly like this, we've bypassed Moodle inserting the correct value that it should be when it's on, and we might get some weird behavior. I mean, let's see what happens if we refresh the page with a purge cache as well. It's off before, it was 7, and now the page is refreshed and it's still off, even though it's set to 1. So the value 1 is probably just messing up Moodle right now. Like, it's never supposed to be number 1. Number 1 will not be the thing to turn it on. The thing to turn it on will be 15. But, we wouldn't know that unless we let Moodle do the insert itself. So it's just another one of these things that it's just another reason to say that you shouldn't update things in the database directly most of the time. We'll just do a purge cache instead, and even though it loads for a while, we've set that to 15 now, so when the page does finally refresh. It was off before. Now when it refreshes, it's on because we've set the value to a sane value that Moodle actually can recognize as being on. Yeah, so we do want to make our changes mostly through the front end.